Hello and welcome to Celebration Bar Review. This is our continuing series on the top 10 myths about the bar exam. And for the last few weeks I've been looking at some of the things that people erroneously believe about the test and about how to study. And this week is a particular favorite of mine because it really has some basis really in my own family going back many years. When our daughter, who's now in law school, was very young, I guess we should have known that she'd probably turn out to be a public interest lawyer, because whenever she saw something that seemed particularly unpleasant or unfair that was happening to her or someone else or one of her friends at school or just wherever, she would come to us and say, "It's not fair." Now, this happened to be her favorite expression as maybe an 8 or 9-year-old, "It's not fair." And it became so pervasive that finally we just shortened it to INF. And finally, as she got older and into high school and continued to think that everything around her was not fair, and that's not entirely accurate, but you get the idea, we just said, look, here's the button, just press the button for "it's not fair." And she would just come up and tap me on the arm, hit the button, and walk away without saying a word. Well, what does that have to do with a myth about the bar exam? Well, results are coming out right now from the previous test, and for the most part, our results as usual are very, very good, and I'm very pleased for our students who've passed their exams. But of course, in any large undertaking, you're going to have people who do fail, sometimes for reasons that are very obvious, and in other places I've posted some videos about why people fail the bar exam, and they're worth, I think, watching or listening. But very often I will get a student, not very often, but sometimes I get a student who seems to have done everything that they're supposed to do. They don't pass, and they say to me, "Why did this happen? It's not fair." Well, the myth I want to look at today is this myth about fairness. There is a street myth, an urban legend, if you will, that the bar examiners somehow know much more about you when they're grading the exam, and they use that information against you. Let me give you an example. I got an email today, in fact, from a student, foreign trained attorney, who did not pass the New York bar exam. And the student said, I'm okay with the fact I didn't pass, I think I can do better, but I'm really concerned because it seems to me that foreign trained attorneys don't do as well on the exam, and it's not fair that the examiners, I think, are treating us differently. Well, I understand that student's frustration, and the student is accurate that foreign trained attorneys don't do as well on the test in New York or California or Texas. That's a statistical reality. What's not accurate, however, is this notion that the examiners take the exams, the essays, the performance tests, even the multi-state, and they set it apart and they say, here's an exam from a foreign trained attorney. Let's grade it differently. Let's grade it more strictly. Let's give less weight to the work that's done, or less credibility to the work that's done. If you read the bar examiners' literature, their internal publications and magazines and their conferences and so on, it is absolutely untrue that the examiners in any jurisdiction that I'm aware of make any effort to do anything other than to have blind grading. That is to say that the grader, the reader, has no idea whose essays or performance tests they're looking at. The multi-state is a machine-scored test. The machine has no idea. The statistical models, the mathematical models of passing and failing, are blind. They are simply numerical models. In other words, there is no opportunity in the process for a single individual with subjective experience to say this person passes or this person fails based on gender, race, creed, background, anything. The point of that, I suppose, would be if you really thought the examiners weren't being fair, you would look to the character and fitness application in that process. And certainly there are states that are more difficult than others in that regard. But that's not the same as the test itself. When the examiners talk about testing, they use something called a reliability indicia. And what they mean by that is how reliable, how accurate are the tests. Now, statistically, over a number of years, the multi-state bar exam has a reliability index of 0.90. That means it's 90% accurate to determine success or failure or to be consistent over a period of time. That's good news. The problem, however, is that when you get to written work, in order to get to a 90% reliability on a 30-minute essay, you'd need 30 of them. On a 1-hour essay, you'd need 15 or 16 of them. There are no jurisdictions that we prepare students for that give that many essays. Why? Well, it's just not feasible. It's not timely. It's difficult to do. On a performance test, you need hours and hours and hours of performance tests to reach that .90 reliability. And on a state multiple choice test, you'd need a lot of questions and a lot of psychometric evaluation, and frankly, almost no states do that. So as a result, the reliability of the state part of your exam is much lower than the reliability of the multi-state. Now, there are some states that recognize that and say, here's what we'll do. We'll give a higher weight to the multi-state, or we'll give at least 50% weight to the multi-state, or we'll use something called an equipercentile index, in which we say, here's where the scores break out along the multi-state line, and we'll take our best scores to our worst scores and put them on the same measure. And that's what's done in states like Florida and California. And it's a pretty fair way to make sure that whatever the breakout of scores look like on the reliable test, the multi-state, that becomes our standard for how we're going to grade or scale the essays or performance tests in the state part of the exam. Now, the point I want to make about all of this, because it may sound like it's a lot of bar exam voodoo, is that the examiners go out of their way, in fact, to be fair. So why do people who come from foreign countries have a lower pass rate in some states? And the answer is generally that they have language problems, and secondarily they have familiarity with American law. And they have learned a different writing style. Very often, for example, students from the UK are far too wordy, they're far too formal. What about those essays that clearly give away that someone has difficulty with English? If they're Asian, for example, or Hispanic, and they have difficulty writing proper English grammar. Well, it certainly doesn't help you, and the examiner is not an idiot. They obviously can tell that English is not your first language, but I haven't seen enough evidence over 20 years to believe that inevitably, if they see poor grammar, they're going to mark it down. I've seen some pretty poor grammar from American-trained law students for whom English is supposedly their first language. I don't think that that really is the determinant factor here. I do think what it does, however, is it raises at least the awareness of the reader that you might be coming from a foreign country. But in truth, if you've done the work and you've done the writing properly and you're using the right techniques, it doesn't matter what the language looks like so much as long as it's understandable and legible. I've sometimes had British students who use quaint spellings, the English spellings, the British spellings, if you will, of English words, and they've said, well, is that a bad tell? To use the poker language, is that a bad tell that somehow I'm not from the U.S.? And the answer is, well, it's obvious that you're not from the U.S., but that frankly doesn't seem to matter much in the scoring. I don't see any consistency or correlation there at all. It certainly doesn't make any difference on the multi-state exam. So I would tell you that, while I'd like you to Americanize everything you do, I'd like it to look like you're from Tallahassee or Sacramento or Albany or wherever the exam is being given, that in the end of the day, that probably doesn't matter as much as the quality of the work you do, the legibility, the organization, the ability to marshal the law in support of arguments, all the things that we've been talking about or will talk about, or if you're in our course, the things that we hammer in all the time. My point really is to say that one of the myths that can be so harmful is this myth that somehow the examiners have spotted you or singled you out and they're out to get you. They used to say it's only paranoia if they actually are not looking at you. But the truth is that, Patriot Act aside, I don't think they really are looking at outsiders. I don't think that the examiners have a bias against any particular group. I've heard this said in Florida that there's a bias against Hispanic students. I've heard it said in other places that there's a bias against African American students. Those things may show up from time to time, but I don't think they're real. And so I would tell you that in the essays and in the bar exam, the comment that it's not fair is simply a myth. Well, I hope this is helpful, and I encourage you to continue on with your studies, and next time we'll be back with the next of our series of bar exam myths. Thanks for being with me today, and have a great